I want to welcome everybody. First, let me say that this webinar is being recorded. We recommend that you set your speaker to your screen to speaker view so you'll be able to see the speaker as he's talking. I also want to acknowledge that we are living and working on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, also known as the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. We are situated on the Halaman Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. We are Canadian Voices for Palestinian Rights. This is a nonpartisan community group based in Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario. It aims to create awareness of the effects of the Israeli military occupation on Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the lack of equality for Palestinians living in Israel, and the enduring statelessness of Palestinian refugees in exile. We support justice and equality for all within the frameworks of human rights, international humanitarian law, and UN resolutions. Through its advocacy and educational activities, the group denounces all barriers and oppression created by racism, discrimination, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and colonialism. We'd like to take a few minutes now to introduce the board members. My name is Robert Fantina. Maisa?
I am Maisa Al-Mustafa.
Mamoon?
I'm Mamoon Yanis.
Lillian?
I'm Lillian Patey.
And Kathy?
Kathy Bergen. Whoops, I had...
Okay, our speaker will present for about 40 to 45 minutes. During that time, please feel free to submit questions through the Q&A, and afterwards we'll ask the questions to the speaker. This webinar addresses Nakba Day. On May 15th every year, Palestinians and their supporters around the world commemorate the Nakba, also known as the catastrophe, that happened in 1948. At that time, 2/3 of the Palestinian Arab population, an estimated 750,000 people, were dispossessed from historic Palestine due to the creation of Israel. Our guest today is well prepared to speak on this topic. I'll turn the time over to Kathy Bergen now to introduce him. Kathy?
Thank you. Good morning. It is my honor and privilege to introduce Professor Ilan Pappe today. Professor Pappe is the director of the European Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter. Pappe is a professor of history born in Haifa in 1954. He moved to the UK in 2007. He has written 20 books thus far, among them Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine and On Palestine. He wrote that together with Noam Chomsky. His most recent books are The 10 Myths of Israel and The Biggest Prison on Earth, A History of the Israeli Occupation. Professor Pappe began to research the archives in Israel as they opened up, what happened in 1948 and onward. Much of his research is contained in his numerous articles and books he has written. He confirmed what many had been saying that happened in 1948 and onward, finding the evidence in the Israeli archives. We look forward to hearing you talk about some of this research that you did and help us understand better the Nakba and commemorate a day that is very painful for Palestinians living in Palestine, living in Israel, and around the world. I had the privilege of attending several lectures of Ilan Pappe. I remember the one on the huge roof of the American colony in East Jerusalem. It was hot and it was very, very crowded. It was standing room only, like most of the lectures that he does are. I look forward to hearing you today. Welcome to our webinar, Ilan, and welcome to Canada.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for organizing this. Thank you for the organizers. Thank you for the invitations. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I wish we could all be in the same hall and see each other and talk to each other. It's always much better. But this is the age we live in, and we will have to get used to it. Needless to say that we are speaking in a particular difficult moment in the history of Palestine. And there are so many difficult moments, but of course, moments like this are more brutal, are more horrific and inhuman, and there is a tendency to overlook and maybe forget for a while larger context in which these awful Israeli assaults are taking place. And in this respect, the idea of so many Palestinian communities around the world without really a central organization, and it doesn't matter where they are, whether they are inside Palestine, in the Arab world, in North America, in South America, the idea that there's one day in the year where we make a concentrated effort to talk about the Nakba so that it won't be erased, that it won't be forgotten, is a very important initiative, and something we should all take a part in. And of course, when it is happening in a day like this, it even is easier in many ways to talk about the connection between the past events in 1948 and the present reality in 2029. And of course, the title of the talk, the ongoing Nakba, or as they call it in Arabic, Nakba al-Mustamirra, it is so easy in many ways to see that the ethnic cleansing, the destruction, the killing is still going on in 2021 as it did in 1948. So what I will try and do, and there might be some section that for some of you are familiar, and so I apologize beforehand if for some of you, some of it is not entirely new, but I think everything has to be inside such a, within such a lecture. So what I will do, I will talk about the history leading to the Nakba, the history of the Nakba itself, and then particularly focus on the notion of the ongoing Nakba to show that this is really not an event, but a structure. And then try at the very end of the talk, before opening it up to your comments and questions, talk about the denial of the Nakba and what can we do to challenge that denial, and why is it so important to challenge that denial. So let me first say that since in my mind at least, and in many, I think the mind of quite a few historians nowadays, the Nakba is the outcome of an ideology, of a settler movement, that from the very moment it arrived in Palestine, aimed at perpetrating such a catastrophe against the Palestinian people, or planned to execute an operation of ethnic cleansing as part of its wish to fulfill its vision, and as was articulated by its ideologues, politicians, and leaders. So in many ways, if you look for the roots of the Nakba, or the roots for the ongoing Nakba, you have to go back, in fact, to the late 19th century, to the beginning of, or the appearance of two very powerful lobbies. First, the Christian lobby that was pushing European powers, especially Britain, to take over that part of the Middle East which was still under Turkish or Ottoman rule, and to include in the British Empire Palestine. And it was not easy to convince the British policymakers to do it in the 19th century. The final decision in Britain that actually it would be good to have Palestine within the realm of the British Empire fell on 1915. And then came the second lobby that followed the Christian Zionist lobby, and this was the Jewish Zionist lobby, that in 2 years between 1915 to 1917 succeeded in convincing the British Empire that not only should it strive to occupy Palestine and make it part of the British Empire, it should also help to make it a Jewish Zionist Palestine. And of course, this was all epitomized in the Balfour Declaration that was given on the 2nd of November, 1917. So that's one deep layer of the Nakba we should not forget, especially when we talk to our friends in Britain, but not only in Britain, or we talk friends in the Christian world, we should also mention this. And it's not surprising that not only the Nakba is going on, but also the same lobbies we're talking about are still there in a new form, of course, in a new dress so many years after, but with the same aim, with the same tactics, and with the same kind of support to make Palestine a place without Palestinians. The second layer, historical layer, which is relevant to what happened in 1948, begins in many, many ways in the 1920s. In fact, there's one particular year I would mention, 1926. This is the year when, for the first time, the new rulers of Palestine, the British, allow the Zionist movement to change totally the land regime in Palestine, to ignore customs that were upheld for centuries. And not only do they allow them to buy land from landowners, they allow them to deceive both the landowners and to deceive maybe even the tenants themselves who live on that land, and introduce a new way of behavior, or a new kind of behavior into Palestine that was never there before. And that was that not only do you change the ownership of the land, you're also evicting everybody who lives on that land because it is now your land. This never happened before in Palestine. Now, when I say land, so that this would be understood, we're talking about large tracts of land, which usually included 7 to 10 villages. So land ownership did change hands, but it never had any impact on the people who lived in those villages for centuries. This was not part of the deal. The Zionist movement, with the help of the British authorities, changed the rule, and once you became a landowner, you were entitled, according to the British law, to evict the people who lived as actually the actual owners of the land for centuries. And the first wave of eviction, not on the same scale as in 1948, but the first wave of eviction came in 1926 in two places, Wadi Hawaris and Marj ibn Amr. And this is important because it shows you that the ongoing Nakba begins before the Nakba, if you want, in this sense. And once a settler movement succeeds in evicting a small number of people, its appetite grows, and it believes that it can expel or evict even a larger number of people. It took time, we know this from history, for the Palestinian local leadership and activists to fully understand this mechanism. And by the 1930s, nobody sold land anymore to the Zionist movement. And the Palestinian people rose against the pro-Zionist policy of Britain and upheld an uprising for 3 years against the mighty power of the empire between 1936 to 1939. But while they did succeed in stopping the purchase of land, the uprising or the brutality of the British during that uprising destroyed the military and political elite of the Palestinians, which was absent during the events of the Nakba, which started in 1947. So you have these discrete processes, but they are connected, which have at their heart the two elements that you are familiar from in Canada of settler colonial movement, the element of space and the element of people, or if you want, the dimension of geography and the dimension of demography. The settler movement wants the land without the people, and when it acquires more land, it depopulates more people, or evicts, or ethnically cleanse, use whatever term you want, for the forceful removal of people and replacing them with settlers. So this started very early on and continues to this very day. Now, as for the Nakba itself, in many ways, the failure to purchase more land and the fact that there was Palestinian resistance, and we should remember it and note it and record it, to an anti-colonialist Palestinian resistance in the 30s and the 40s. But they faced a very powerful alliance. Because of that, the decision was by the Zionist leadership, once it was clear that the British rule is coming to an end, to prepare a full-scale eviction of Palestinians from their homes, lands, and villages and towns. We don't know the exact date when this idea materialized into a strategy, but we do know when it was decided to be prepared as a master plan that would direct and instruct the military power that the Zionist community had in Palestine to implement an idea of ethnic cleansing. This started in February 1947. The date of February 1947 is important because this is the date that Britain finally decided to leave Palestine. And the Zionist leadership prepares a year, I would say until February 1948, and regardless of what the United Nations offered in November 1947, it prepares for a whole year the program that materializes into a master plan or into a blueprint in February 1948 for taking as much of the land of historical Palestine as possible and having in it as few Palestinians as possible. And the documentation we can find in the archives, if you couple it with the memoirs of people, the memories of people, and the oral history of people, and the reports of journalists, there were quite a few of them, when you look at all of this, you can see that there was not one village or one neighborhood or one town that was spared from being targeted as part of this preparation for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, which means that if there were, and there were, 80 villages remained inside Israel out of 600. The 80 villages that remained inside Israel remained not because there was no intention to evict them. There are different explanations why it was not a complete ethnic cleansing. And in fact, because not every village was expelled and Palestinians, a small minority of Palestinians remained within what became the state of Israel and were called later by the Israeli Arabs, because of this incompletion, the idea of ethnically cleansing the Palestinian did not die because the project was not completed. This is at the level of demography, but it's also true about the level of geography. During the events of 48, Israel was able to take 78% of Palestine and therefore waited for the historical opportunity to take over 100% of historical Palestine. And when it did it in 1967, again, it had to balance its greed for territory with its wish to downsize drastically, if not absolutely or entirely, the number of Palestinians in what became the Jewish state, or the extended Jewish state in 1967. We should never forget what happened in those months of 1947 and 1948. I will go over it rather quickly because I think many of you know it. But I would say that basically from February 1948 to December 1948, so actually within 9 months, the Israeli military forces, and before that the Zionist military forces, which until May 1948 were many more than anything the Palestinians were able to galvanize, and still had the upper hand in every military aspect, even when the Arab neighbors sent some Arab units to help the Palestinians in May 1948. The Israeli army, facing that kind of resistance, began evicting village by village in February 1948, when the British were still responsible for law and order, moved in April 1948 to the cities of the mixed cities of Jaffa and Haifa, and also to the Palestinian cities or towns such as Akka, Safad, and Baisan. And by the end of April 1948, already expelled most of the urban population from Palestine. The chronology is, I will just mention before I summarize the 9 months between February to October to the end of 48. The chronology is always important to remember, especially on the Nakba day. We should mention it again if you will ever face, and some of you are facing, I'm sure, the Israeli version or narrative of this. By May 1948, by the time the first Arab soldier comes from a neighboring Arab state to try and help the Palestinian, by that time, already hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were refugees. And therefore, the narrative that you can still read even in the website of your foreign ministry or in your official university's textbook and so on, that the Arab world declared a war on Israel, and because of that, the Palestinians became refugees. This is a historical fabrication. Israel declared war on the Palestinians, and by the time hundreds of thousands of Palestinians became refugees under the pressure of their public opinion, Arab governments were willing to send some troops into Palestine, which was too late and too little. And this is very important to stress. This is one of these facts that you don't need the archive for. This is just a clear chronological fact that undermines all the Israeli propaganda of why the Palestinians became refugees. And I think it's important to mention it. In any case, when 9 months have passed since February 1948, 531 Palestinian villages were destroyed, 11 Palestinian towns were demolished, and half of Palestine's population became refugees. And these 3 terrible outcomes happened because the people and the land and their houses and the village and the towns were victims of an ethnic cleansing operation. Any attempt to say where in one place they actually ran away and in another place they decided to hide and didn't come back to the village, all these are not relevant if you want to examine the question whether Israel did or did not perpetrate ethnic cleansing against the Palestinian in 1948. Whatever the means was, the aim was the same. And the aim was to expel people who lived for centuries from their homes, from their villages, from the towns, in order to implement a vision of a Palestine that would be as purely Jewish as possible by the hands of the Zionist movement. Now, I know for some of you, you may say, okay, why does he keep saying it? It's so obvious. Well, talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends, talk to your politicians, and see on what kind of narrative they have been fed over the years to understand why we should continue to hammer in these basic facts of what happened, what was the policy, how it was implemented, and mainly what was its outcome. Now, of course, the Nakba was not just the expulsion of people. It was not just a loss of a field, of a village. It was loss of businesses, of a very elaborate and progressive educational system, of cultural life, of bank accounts. And all this is also part of the catastrophe, the horrible catastrophe that befell the Palestinian people in those months between the end of 47 to the end of 1948. Part of the Nakba is also the immediate way that the new state of Israel began to erase, or trying to, they did not succeed, thank God, but trying to erase any evidence for the existence of Palestinian life before the creation of the state of Israel. They did it through bulldozering the villages, flattening them, destroying hundreds of Palestinian homes in the cities, building on the destroyed villages, either Jewish settlements or planting on them European forests, because they did not only want to cover a village with a forest, they wanted to cover it with the European forest that would give the landscape a sense that it's not part of the Arab world and not part of the Middle East. So they also wanted to ethnically cleanse the landscape, not just the people and their belongings. The Nakba was going on after that as well. As I said, a small number of Palestinians remained inside what became the State of Israel. By December 1948, Israel had a population of 100,000 Palestinians who were not expelled out of the new state's boundaries, 100,000. And by the way, out of 1 million who used to live in what became the State of Israel. These 100,000 people were pushed in the villages, out of their villages into smaller villages. So Israel continued to downsize the number of villages even in 49, 1950, 1951, and forced Palestinians to move to several villages so that they could control them as much as they could. They did a similar thing to the people who were left behind in places such as Jaffa, Akka, and Haifa, where Palestinians were pushed from all the neighborhoods in those towns into one neighborhood, usually the poorest neighborhood, and they were ghettoized in that neighborhood. This was Wadi Nisnas in Haifa, Ajami in Jaffa, and the old city in Akka, Part of the ongoing Nakba is there are two sort of sides for the ongoing Nakba after 48, I would say until 1967. One part is not to allow the refugees to return. It's very interesting to read the reports of the State Department, the American State Department, between 1948 roughly until 1953. The State Department keeps sending messages, first to President Truman, then to President Eisenhower, that they do not understand why the United States does not pressure Israel, now that the war has subsided, to allow these people to return to their homes. John Foster Dulles, who came to Israel, said, there's enough room for these people to come in. Why? There's no need to create a refugee problem, whatever happened, he said in 1948. And at one point, Truman was willing, and then Eisenhower as well, to impose some sanctions on Israel in order to force it to allow the return of the refugees, which also the United Nations supported very clearly. But this was the beginning of a very effective pro-Israeli lobby that succeeded in counterbalancing this more universal, if you want, moment in the way in American policy towards Palestine, where I don't have to tell you, was not repeated many times after. But even they could not. So the Israeli policy of not allowing refugees to return, forget the question why they became refugees, not allowing them to return as unacceptable behavior of a new member state of the United Nations. In fact, the Americans always said, we will not support Israel's membership in the United Nations if they will not allow the refugees to return. But they did not keep their word, as you know. The other side of that kind of behavior was which again, the international community did not like, but didn't do anything about, was the imposition of military rule on the Palestinians who were left in Israel until 1966. Some of you who have visited the West Bank know exactly what the military rule means. Absolute control of the army, even the lowest ranks of the army in your life. They can kill you, they can banish you, they can arrest you, they can destroy your business and house, they can forbid you from moving around, for getting a job, and absolute control by a military mechanism, including military court, in the life of people, which inevitably brought also about atrocities such as the Kfar Qasim massacre in 1956. So I think we should include also, I used to call, in a book I wrote, I called it The Forgotten Palestinians. Sometimes this particular abuse, systematic abuse, cruel, callous abuse of Palestinian citizens inside Israel from 1948 to 1966 should be also included when we are looking and trying to explain to people that the catastrophe that befell on the Palestinian, the ethnic cleansing that Israel perpetrated against them did not stop in 1948, and there isn't one Palestinian group, even after the fragmentation of the Palestinian people to different groups, that was not affected in one way or another. Israel, of course, transferred that military rule in 1967 and imposed it on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip with the same people who abused Palestinians within Israel, began their job in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip under the same legal structure, with the same idea of a military, total military control in the life of people. And any one of you who's been there or has written even conservative reports by human rights organization knows exactly what daily life under military rule, especially under Israeli military rule, looks like. And I think that's another ongoing Nakba. To this, you can add that immediately after 1967, there was an attempt, and in fact, it was not a totally successful attempt, but again, the intention was there to try and downsize dramatically the number of people who lived in the Gaza Strip and the number of people who lived in the West Bank, so that Israel could have the territory with less Palestinians. Israel expelled 300,000 Palestinians from the West Bank in the immediate aftermath of the 1967 war. I don't have time to elaborate of all the places it happened, but the number is huge. And they tried, but they gave up for the last moment because they didn't think they had the capacity to do the same for people in the Gaza Strip, partly because Egypt's Nasser, Egypt Nasser, it was still Egypt Nasser, 67 to 69, made it very clear that they will not go along with such mass expulsion from Gaza to the Sinai. But the intention was there. So the Nakba is going on either on the ground or still as an idea in the minds of Israeli policy makers. We're coming to the 1970s, the mid-1970s. A different aspect of the ongoing Nakba is the expansion of Jewish settlements in the West Bank through expropriation of land, through eviction of people who live on that land, and through banishment and exile of people who try to resist it. And so the Judaization in the West Bank is one part of the ongoing Nakba in the 1970s. At the same time, there's a similar effort of Judaization in the Galilee in 1976, and there is a Palestinian resistance to it in the famous Day of the Land on the 30th of March 1976. But despite all this resistance, and we always should talk about the resistance to the ongoing Nakba as much as we're talking about the ongoing Nakba itself. But this is a different chapter to talk about. But I just want to mention, to make sure that you don't get the impression we're talking here about passive people who allowed these things to happen to them. They were just facing a very powerful machine of destruction, expulsion, and colonization. I would include in this also the war atrocities in 1982 against the Palestinian refugee camps. There was a famous United Nations report written by Sean McBride, a human rights lawyer from Ireland that was appointed by the United Nations to describe what Israel did in Lebanon during June 1982. If you read it and you compare it to what they did to Palestine and the Palestinians in 1948, you don't need to be convinced that there is here a structure, there is a pattern of continuity, and that we are still in 1982 in the same chapter of an ideological movement that has a state and an army that wishes to take a homeland of someone else and make sure that the indigenous people who live there are not there anymore. It's very clear that the 21st century has its own chapters of the ongoing Nakba. If I start, I will end with Gaza because I want to end with what's happening today. So let's start with the north, and even beyond the north of Palestine. Let's not forget the Palestinian refugees, whether it is before 2012 or after 2012, whether they are in Lebanon, Syria, or Jordan. Not allowing these refugees to return in 2021 or in 2001 is part of the same ongoing Nakba. We should always mention it to people that the catastrophe also goes on when the right of return is not implemented and not respected and not upheld. Now, if you go to the north of Israel in the beginning of 21st century, of our century, there is a vast continued effort of Judaization, of strangulating Palestinian villages, not allowing them to build new villages, not allowing them to expand their villages, and downsizing the space in which you live, and trying to create economic and social conditions that would encourage you to leave is also in kind of an incremental ethnic cleansing and part of that historical chapter. And if we move to the West Bank, some of you, I'm sure, are familiar as much as I am with the ethnic cleansing of the Jordan Valley, of the greater Jerusalem area, of the area south of Halil, Hebron, Masaf Yeriata, as the Palestinians call that area, where a matrix of military harassment, settlers harassment, and all kinds of other governmental organizations are trying to force Palestinians out of Area C, according to the Oslo Accord. Area C, as you know, constitutes 60% of the West Bank. This is now the main territorial target of the settler colonial state as far as the ongoing Nakba is concerned within the West Bank. But if we move from there to the Nakab, the Bedouin Palestinian community, already in 1948 and 49, but definitely in this century in particular, is being targeted. Their villages are being destroyed. These are, anyway, unrecognized villages that never received any infrastructure from the state, and they're building it, they're rebuilding it, and the government continues to destroy, and instead of their land tries to plant, which is a crazy idea, pine trees in the desert. I don't know, they don't like the desert. Pine trees in the desert, or allow individual Jews to have spaces and territories that used to belong to a whole villages. This is also part of the ongoing Nakba. And I will finish with Gaza. Gaza until 2006 was a victim of the ongoing Nakba, very much as the West Bank. But something happened, of course, after the Hamas took over, won the elections there. This complicated an Israeli plan that looked already fixed, namely to allow the Palestinians to be crammed into area A and B in the West Bank, 40% of the West Bank, and be crammed into the Gaza Strip, and tell the world that in due course, these two areas would become a state or a mini-state, and this would be the end of the conflict. But this, they didn't like the idea that in the Gaza Bantustan, the Hamas would be in control and not the PA. And I don't have to tell you this, you really all know what means Israel is using since 2006 until today in order to have its will in the Gaza Strip, one war crime against the other. And if you accumulate these war crimes together, they become a crime against humanity. And if you look at them within a historical perspective since 2006, they are really an incremental genocidal action as part of the ongoing Nakba. And I'm sure you will have a lot of questions what goes on today, so I won't say too much of it, but it's very important to distinguish between the immediate background for what goes on today, which is a series of provocation instigated by a criminal Israeli prime minister who lost his fight to remain in power and maybe on his way to court, if not in his way to jail. He instigated this series of provocation that he knew would force the Hamas, and not just the Hamas, would also create anger all over Palestine and beyond by really violating the sacredness of Haram al-Sharif and Al-Aqsa Mosque, by evicting forcefully people from Palestinian neighborhoods in Jerusalem. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he doesn't even mind that it turned into a violent clash within Israel itself, where, of course, the police stands by the Jewish hooligans and the Palestinian youth is trying to defend their property and houses. Now, this is the immediate background, but we always have to remind whoever you're talking to, whether it's a policymaker, whether it's a journal, a newspaper, any kind of media outlet, educational system, you always have to put it in the wider historical context. The reason, always the reason that there is a cycle of violence in Palestine goes back to the Nakba and to the ongoing Nakba. This is the major reason why people are losing their lives. And therefore, it also gives you an idea what is the way to stop it. The way to stop it is to make sure that the ideology that feeds the policies of the ongoing Nakba, it would be branded around the world as a racist ideology, an unacceptable ideology, and a regime that is based on that ideology should not be accepted to the group of civilized nation. This is a tall mission that I'm putting in front of you, but I think this is something we have begun doing, all of us, you as well, many of you as well, but I think we should continue. Finally, I'm getting to the end of my 45 minutes. The Nakba is still denied in places where you are really bewildered that it's still possible to hear, senior policymakers in the West, educated scholars, very well-informed journalists, have no idea of what went on in 1948, do not understand the structure of violence that is still in operation since 1948 until today. And because of that, even with good intentions, they support a language and a discourse about what goes on there that only helps Israel to perpetuate its ongoing Nakba or its colonization of Palestine. A struggle against the Nakba denial begins, in my mind, with language, with changing the language we are talking. We don't talk about conflict, we talk about colonization. We don't talk about peace, we talk about decolonization or change of regime. We don't talk about the only democracy in the Middle East, we're talking about an apartheid state. And all these important entries in the new vocabulary can help to begin and clarify, at least for those who are willing to listen to us, the fact that the Palestinians were victims of, twice victims of a crime, the crime itself and the crime of denial, which is as hurtful, as powerful as the crime itself. We have the tools to fight against this Nakba denial. You will be accused of anti-Semitism when you do this, but you should not cave into such accusation. You should be ambassadors and ambassadress of telling the world both of what happened and the fact that what happened still occurs, is not stopping. And there is a direct line between the family that was bombarded this morning, which included 2 women, 8 children, by the Israeli Air Force, and the women and children that were massacred in Al-Dawaima in October 1948. The same ideology was behind that massacre in both places. The same ideology educated the troops in the case of 48 and the pilots in the case of our days. And the inability of people who usually would use universal language of human rights, of civil rights, who would be shocked by acts of barbarism, their inability to apply the same universal look at what happened in Palestine in 1948 until today is amazing, is bewildering, but is something that we should strive to change and make sure that the exceptionalism that Israel benefits from does not include the right of people to deny the Nakba and not to deny the ongoing Nakba. So I will stop here and I will be very, very happy to take your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Pappe. This was extremely interesting and informative. There have been a variety of questions submitted while you were talking. So the first one I'd like to ask is, as a person who grew up in the occupied territories, do you see a shift in the support for the Palestinian cause among Jewish Israelis?
Yeah, I wish I could be the bearer of good news here. Well, there is kind of a general answer, which, to be fair and honest, is to say that if anything, it's moving the other direction. Namely, the whole Israeli political system has moved to the right. We don't have really anything like maybe we used to have a more left-leaning or more liberal-leaning Zionists in Israel. There are only 2 options today for Israelis who vote. Either they vote for the center or for the right wing, which means we cannot expect much from a change within the Israeli Jewish society, which means, of course, that this gives justification to anyone who supports a strong and poignant campaign of pressure on Israel from the outside. However, there is a potential among the younger generation, and you can see it in parts in the Jewish civil society, to enhance an existing very small group of people who understand this, young people who refuse to go to the army, young people who know what happened in 1948, young people who have a worldview that on the one hand allows them to see themselves as part of the country, but nonetheless not entirely part of the state. I think they would be empowered if there was a clear Palestinian project of liberation in the future, a clear Palestinian leadership, a clear Palestinian project. And I think the lack of this reality is one of the reasons that does not allow us to increase that group, but of course it's not the main reason. The main reason is that the Israeli ideological grip of people is very powerful. And to deprogram them will take a long time and a very intensive unlearning.
Okay, I'll ask the second question. In a recent dialogue you had with American philosopher Judith Butler, she raised the point about the importance of creating this international alliance to address the systematic racism and actually the continuous Nakba as a structure against Palestinians. How can we start this alliance, or at least build on what's happening now with increased visibility and increased solidarity with the Palestinian question?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I think the alliance is there. The beginning of the alliance is already there. I mean, I remember, and it goes both ways. The way that, for example, Black Lives Matter totally identify with the Palestinian struggle. The way that Palestinians in Gaza, I remember demonstrating in support of the African Americans in Ferguson. We are beginning to build, I can see the beginning of building ties between indigenous people, also in Canada, with the Palestinians. I think there is an awareness that the counter-alliance to the alliance that supports the colonization, the oppression, and the apartheid, that the counter-alliance is much bigger than we thought. But we need to find the partners. We need to cement this alliance, which should include people who are economically oppressed, culturally oppressed, and politically oppressed. And unfortunately, there are many people like this still in our world. And because of the global economy and the corporations and so on, some of that oppression is interconnected, like the fact that this Israeli security know-how is used against people in Brazil and in Ferguson is just one of many examples for that kind of connection. So exposing the international connection behind the oppression on the one hand and created a counter international solidarity movement is very good. You know, on Wednesday, I had a similar conversation with Yanis Varoufakis. And as you know, he and Bernie Sanders created what an international movement of solidarity, not just for the case of Palestine, but to the case of other issues. But I think there is an interesting basis there to include Palestine, and they include, by the way, both of them, Palestine, as a very important part of their wish to create an international solidarity vis-a-vis the forces that exploit us, manipulate us, and in some places, of course, oppress us and create for us existential dangers.
Thank you. Next question is this. You mentioned that Presidents Truman and Eisenhower were willing to issue sanctions against Israel if Israel didn't adhere to international law. Why wasn't that done then? And what has changed that more recent presidents, including the current one, will not even consider this?
Yeah, well, not for not applying international law, but specifically for not allowing the return of the refugees. I think until, my guess is until 1953, 1954, people in the State Department still had some influence on American policy at the time. And many of the senior officials who work in the State Department did see the situation in Palestine from more than one angle and were able to identify the suffering of the Palestinians, the impracticability of the partition plan. They are the ones who pushed the United States, which they've nearly done it, to declare the partition plan in February 1948 as invalid and suggest that the two sides would renegotiate a different peace plan, which the Palestinians would accept and not impose on them a plan that they did not accept. So you had still diplomats, experts within the American administration that still had some weight on the presidency, on the executive power. However, exactly this kind of power gave rise to the process that eventually ended in the creation of AIPAC. And already before the official creation of AIPAC, there were, in this case, the pro-Israeli Jewish lobby was able successfully to counter these more general impulses by the American administration and orientated the American policy onto the lines that we are familiar with. But I should say also President Kennedy, he didn't influence, we know that because documents are opening up. Kennedy did not threaten Israel with sanctions, but he was about to move in the United Nations a new call under American auspices for the return of the refugees, which really got Israel worried. And then he was assassinated. I'm not saying the two is connected, but it's interesting. The coincidence there is very interesting. So it continued for a while, but then of course it moved to the direction we are familiar with.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I had a question that's been raised by many students who been introduced to the question of Palestine and the whole series of the conflict. Some students asked that you used the term ethnic cleansing about the crime and what happened with the Nakba. Why we cannot use, or we did not use yet, the term cultural or political genocide?
Yeah, well, I think it's very important to be accurate in these instances and understand that ethnic cleansing is as hideous crime as genocide. It fits much better what the strategy of Israel was and is. And it also is very much in the line of the definitions we have of ethnic cleansing in international law, and even the definition used by the American State Department and scholars around the world. So I think it's a far more accurate description for the crime. It's a crime against humanity, by the way. I don't think, as I said, and I also wrote about it, I think there's a different story evolving in Gaza since 2006, which I called incremental genocide, because there, the idea of ethnic cleansing is not working. There's nowhere to kick out. The Gaza Strip is full of victims of the ethnic cleansing of 1948, but there's nowhere to ethnically cleanse them again. And that's when ethnic cleansing becomes genocidal. And I think that there's a difference. And I think we have to convince people to be on our side with a clear conversation, but these conversations should be opened up again and again, and we should examine also other definitions. I have no problem with that. I think it's important to think about it again and again.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, next question we have. In the news yesterday, there were reports that protests had started on the borders with Jordan and Lebanon. Can you comment on this, the potential for tipping this? If there's any other potential for assistance or actions from other nations in this area?
Yes, there are demonstrations because it's the Nakba Day on the borders with Jordan and Lebanon. They're not huge, one has to say the truth. And I don't think that, unfortunately, I don't think the Israeli army cannot deal with it, and it already killed one demonstrator on the border with Lebanon. But you're right of asking a more general question. Well, we have a problem where we know that there's a gap which is growing every day between the position of the Arab societies and the position of the Arab governments or regimes. The Arab governments, not all of them, but quite a few of them, would like to normalize relationship with Israel. They see it as an assured passage to having good relationship with the United States, and therefore, whatever rhetorical reaction we will hear from them about what goes on in Gaza, I would not hold my breath and wait for any meaningful action on their side. The big question connects to the Arab Spring. I mean, are the societies there able to impact the policies, including the policy on Palestine, through a process of democratization, as had been seen in the Arab Spring? It's not surprising that during the demonstration of the Arab Spring, wherever they were, the Palestinian flag was flying very high, because it symbolizes not just the liberation of Palestine, but also the liberation of the people all over the Arab world.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will ask a question that was one of the first questions we received. I think it holds kind of like importance because it will open the discussion about what ways or what way forward to challenge this settler colonial ideology and movement and bring an end to the occupation. And I can add to that also raise and address the thing about the right of return for refugees and address the issue and circumstances of citizenships of Palestinian within the state of Israel. So what ways can we challenge this ongoing project?
Well, I think it's a complex things, a number of things that have to happen. Some of them are happening, some of them hopefully would happen and haven't happened yet. And once they are all connected in a powerful way, I think they have the power to do this. I remember a lecture by a colleague who said that 12 conditions that have to be fulfilled for the liberation of Palestine. I'm a bit more optimistic. I don't need 12. I would be happy with, first of all, a clear Palestinian leadership and a vision and a way towards the vision, a clear definition what the Palestinians mean by the liberation of Palestine in this century, or the decolonization of Palestine, a message which is important also for the Jews who live in Palestine, and for the world to know exactly what they are supporting. This is one thing that I think should happen. What has already happened is a serious shift in the global view about Palestine among civil society. Some of it even was transferred to politicians, as we know. There we should continue the effort, because the main weapon against this positive development is the accusation of anti-Semitism. In some cases, it terrifies people. Some people just don't want to bother with being an anti-Semite and so on. We need to find a more effective way of working on it. And I think so that's the second one. And the third one for me is, but I think this is the last stage after we have a clear kind of change in the Palestinian side, and we have a very solid support in the civil society, is of course to see if we can do what happened in the struggle for justice in South Africa, which is to move from a civil society to policies from above. If you want to move from boycott to sanctions to begin with. And then, and it doesn't have to happen in the West only. I mean, we need to include the whole world in this. And then maybe we will enhance even a change from within the Jewish society in Israel. But this will not happen. And the most important things are the first one. So I think it's clear what we need to see. The question is, can we do it? But as far as people working outside of Palestine, yes, using the right language, not being intimidated by accusation of anti-Semitism, and making sure that not only those who are convinced hear it, but also those who are not with us open their eyes and ears to see, to show that this is a pure anti-racist, universalist, humanist position that drives us, and not anything else. And this is why we are so passionate about it. And this is why we show solidarity.
Thank you.
Okay, the next question that came in was, did the expelled people receive any compensation in form of money or support in some other way?
No, the expelled people, no, they didn't, not a penny. And there are some Palestinian who calculated, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but calculated exactly what was lost in terms of money, in terms of assets. It's a huge number in today's currency. No, not a penny was given back or compensated. And I think it's important in this connection to remind us once more about the United Nations Resolution 194 from the 11th of December 1948 that is being reaffirmed every year by the United Nations, that calls on the unconditional right of the Palestinians to return and or their compensation. So part of a genuine reconciliation, part of a solution will have to include compensation for those who return and those who don't return. I think this is obvious, but of course this hasn't unfortunately happened as yet.
Thank you.
Okay, in another interview you had with regards to ethnic cleansing, you were asked about your feelings while you were searching the archives, and you talked about the feeling of a shock of the brutality of Zionist military forces against the Palestinians, especially that they were kind of like the victim of most of them came as victims of Holocaust and another brutal crime that happened in Europe against them. Can you elaborate a bit about that particular element, please?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I was shocked because first of all, I was brought up in a certain educational indoctrinational system, which conveyed the message that we are the most moral people on earth. So, you know, if you're being brought up that you are just living in at least a normal society, maybe the shock is not so big. The shock was particularly big because we were brought up as if, you know, this is the only moral army in the world. So that should be said as well. But the atrocities were really on a level and scope that shocked me, absolutely. And I think that I'm trying to. What was your second part of the question?
You talked about your shock of the brutality, and during your presentation today, you mentioned how they tried to downsize the people who refused to leave and put them in same of ghettos, which is very much related to the Jewish kind of.
I remember your second half.
Yeah, exactly.
You just needed to say,
it's very much related.
You just need to say the word ghetto, and I remember. Yes. So I wanted to say two things about it. Sorry.
Okay.
One is that not all the people who executed the crimes in 48 were direct survivors of the Holocaust. Very few of them were. Most of them were settlers who were there before the Holocaust. Most of them, definitely the officers and the people who orchestrated the ethnic cleansing and executed the most vicious part of it were not exactly Holocaust survivors, but they claimed to be Holocaust survivors. And they did it in the name of the Holocaust. So they abused the Holocaust memory actually by doing this. There is always a possibility that someone who's a victim becomes a victimizer. Abused children can become abusive parents. We know that. But I think here it was less this case of how can victims of, it's part of the story that you should answer, of course. How can victims of years and years of persecution and anti-Semitism do the same to other people? Absolutely. A relevant question and one we should ask the Israelis. But I think that there was even a manipulation of people who were not themselves victims of that persecution, claiming that they have the right to do what they are doing because they were victims of persecution. There are some brave Israeli historians and sociologists who wrote about this cynical manipulation of the Holocaust memory to justify brutal policies towards the Palestinians. So I think it's an important topic to look at even in more detail in the future. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah. Sorry, desperate. Yeah, go on, please.
In your view, how important is BDS in putting pressure on Israel?
I think the BDS is very important. I think it really is a powerful message. It sends a powerful message to Israel that there's a pride stake attached to its policy, its behavior, its ideology, and that's why I think it galvanized so many people. I think in order to fully understand its importance, you have to realize that the solidity of the state of Israel is kind of upheld on the basis of two pillars. There is the material pillar and there is the moral pillar. I'm not sure how far the BDS would, although it tries and it has some impressive achievements, is able to erode the material pillar on which Israel is based, namely its strategic connections with multinational corporations, with China, with India, with, of course, the West, its high-tech abilities, its economic stability, and so on. Although I think it's important to show that these are also targets. But when it comes to the moral pillar, I think the BDS was very successful in asking normal people around the world with a modicum of decency in them, can you really stand by such a state when you know what you know now? You cannot argue or claim that you're ignorant about it. You cannot sort of hide behind ignorance anymore. And I think it worked, and I think it can work even better. And you can always improve it, but I think it plays an important role. It's not the vision for the future, but it exposes exactly the abuses that needs to be rejected and challenged by the international community.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question came in. What can internationals do to help a change of the Palestinian leadership?
Well, for me, I think we have to be very careful, of course, when we are not part of the polity that we want it to have a different leadership. I think the best way to approach is to indicate something maybe people are not fully aware of. The Palestinian society, wherever it is one of the youngest in the world, really one of the youngest in the world. More than 50% are very young people. When I accumulate all the Palestinian communities together, I think they have a different vision of politics. They have a different vision of representation. I don't think they're always very well organized. This happened with the Arab Spring in 2011 and happened in Occupy Wall Street. But I think this will be solved. This will change. And I think we should let young Palestinians, and if you are a young Palestinian in Canada or in America or in London, I think you have the absolute right to be part of that process. And I think there's a lot of networking going on this between young Palestinians, exactly because the internet allows us to transcend physical borders and create a joint discourse in which we discuss a future project. So I think that anyone who's a Palestinian should take part of it. Anyone who is not a Palestinian should support a change. But the nature of solidarity is that you wait to hear what people need from you. You don't tell them what they need.
Thank you. Next question that came in is related to that. How can Palestinians have a strong leader when anyone who comes forward is imprisoned or killed by the Israelis?
No, I fully agree. I never accepted this idea that there's no one to talk to on the Palestinian side when Israel kills anyone that they could talk to. There's no, it's a fact. It is a fact, and that's what they are doing. There's another kind of side to this story when the Israelis say, oh, if the Palestinians only had a Nelson Mandela or a Martin Luther King, then we could talk to them. I always say, even the Palestinians were led by Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, and Mother Teresa. the same Israeli attitude, the Israeli attitude will not change. It would be the same attitude. So it's not a matter of quality of leadership. We all want a better leadership, but there is no wish on the Israeli side to talk and negotiate. There is a wish to dictate and impose their worldview on the Palestinians. And they either do it by force or they do it through negotiations or both. And this is something we find difficult to explain to the more decent people among policymakers who are involved and can be involved in changing the reality on the ground. This is a big task we have to make them see that this is what's going on.
Okay, thank you. Another question that came in, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is being weaponized around the world to stifle criticism of Israel. What are the best ways to counter it?
Yes, I should just be accurate. The IHRA definition is about what is a Holocaust denial. It includes anti-Semitism, but the main purpose is to define what is a Holocaust denial. And unfortunately, it includes criticizing Israel as being equivalent to Holocaust denial, which is really absurd and unacceptable. What we should do is a good question, because I think a lot of governments have adopted it. In Britain, the Ministry of Higher Education adopted it and wants to force the universities in Britain to accept it. We need to struggle against it with all power that we have. There was one interesting attempt. I'm not sure it went far enough, but I liked it, at least the effort, called the Jerusalem Declaration of Israelis and Jews around the world who do not accept the IHRA weaponization of anti-Semitism, as you rightly put it. I think we need more than that. We need a stronger language against it and create our own alliance against that particular alliance, and make sure that the most important thing is that we don't cave in, because it's a tactic of intimidation. And we know that we are not a Holocaust denier. We know that we are not anti-Semites, and we should not be afraid if someone calls us this, because what matters is what we know about ourselves, and we know exactly where we're coming from and why we are saying and doing what we're doing.
Thank you. Another question, do you think that Israeli society is an integrated unit with the Zionist movement, based partly on the declaration of the Jewish state law that passed a while ago?
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure I fully understand.
I think what's being asked is, how united is Israeli society
behind
with
the
Zionism?
nationality law?
Well, with the Jewish state law.
Yeah, okay, I understand it. Yeah, well, it's really a replica of the answer to the question that was asked earlier on about a change within the Jewish public opinion, or different voices in the Jewish public opinion. Unfortunately, the vast majority of Jews, not all of them, but the vast majority of Jews support the nationality law, believe in it. Put differently is that because the whole idea of liberal Zionism, as I mentioned before, that supposedly you can be a liberal colonizer, a progressive ethnic cleanser, an enlightened occupier, this kind of idea that liberal Zionism has pushed forward is not working anymore. And Israelis, I think rightly, don't want to subscribe to such an exercise. Unfortunately, what they're left with is the question whether what do they prefer, to live in a democracy or to live in an ethnic racist state. And the vast majority, and this is shown again and again, prefer the latter option, unfortunately, which is the result of years of indoctrination, educational system, and so on, and fear, both manipulated fear and genuine fear. We have to find the ways of dealing with it, but the simple answer is it has a very wide support among the Israeli Jewish electorate, unfortunately.
Thank you. Lisa?
Yeah, I have a question with regards to the call for decolonization, and I would like to hear from you about how do you understand decolonization? I know it's a big topic, but maybe provide our audience with some insights about what do you mean by decolonization? Are we talking about power dynamics, transformation? Are we talking about repositionings? So please, some insights will be great. I think this will be also our last question. So something about decolonization at the end would be great.
Definitely, definitely. And it's a very good question. In fact, in my Center for Palestine Studies in Exeter, we had 2 excellent workshops. And the question in the workshop is, what is decolonization in Palestine in 21st century? And 12 experts from around the world gave different 12 answers to this question. For me, first of all, I want to say it's understandable and not an easy question, because talking about colonialism in the 21st century would sound anachronism to many people. But it is right to talk about colonialism in 21st century because it is there. As someone, an American activist said, usually that was teaching about colonialism, he said, I stopped teaching, I just keep taking them to tours to Israel so that they will understand what colonialism is. There's no need anymore to read about it. You can still see it in life. But decolonization needs to be worked out, needs to be detailed. I fully agree with you. In a nutshell, as kind of a bullet, and this is only my view, I don't commit anyone, but I'm part of an initiative called the Initiative for One Democratic State in Palestine. And we have a 10 program, 10 points program in which we try to detail what decolonization means. I don't give you all the 10 points, but the basic idea is, first of all, dismantling of all the colonial institutions, all the institution and legal structure that allow the state to discriminate against other people. Secondly, decolonization needs to include rectification of past evil, compensation, return, repatriation, and so on. You need to find the mechanism of doing it alongside of the dismantlement. Thirdly, I think you need to find a way where you want to respect collective identities of people, insist on it. There's no problem with that, provided these collective identities are not used in order to oppress others. And in the particular case of Palestine, it will be very painful, but this is part of decolonization, for the Jewish citizens today of Israel to recognize 2 things without which they will continue to live in a state of violence and conflict, which they believe they will always come up with the upper hand. I'm not entirely sure about it. And the 2 things that they have to acknowledge and recognize is that they will have to give up many of their privileges if you want to create a democratic state in Palestine, like some of the whites eventually understood in apartheid South Africa. And secondly, that they are the settlers who entered the homeland of the indigenous. It doesn't mean that you, as one Palestinian scholar has very nicely put it doesn't mean that you cannot indigenize eventually the settlers. Of course you can, but you need to understand the basic departure point, namely that this is an Arab country in the Arab world, which has unique circumstances, definitely, and a large number of Jews. And maybe I will end, since this is my last sentence, I suppose, with something I always end, but this is just, I think it's good food for thought. I always say that there are 3 A's that have to be fulfilled if you want to start and talk seriously about an end to the problems in Palestine. The first A is acknowledgement, and we talked a lot about it in my talk. You have to acknowledge what happened to the Palestinians before 48, during 48, and after 48. The second A is accountability. It's not enough to acknowledge expulsion. You need to be accountable for this. Most of the people who did it are not alive anymore, so it's not a matter of bringing them to trial. It's a matter of allowing the return as the best way of showing accountability for the expulsion, return and compensation. And the third A is acceptance. I think finally, and I don't think it would be a huge problem, the Palestinians would accept a sizable Jewish community in historical Palestine as part of their life, as part of the future, as part of their vision. There's much more readiness on the Palestinian side to do this than on the side of the settlers. Even now, even after 100 years of colonization, it's quite amazing, especially Palestinians who live there, are not motivated by impulses of revenge. They are motivated by impulse of demanding normal and regular life like anyone else. And this is what is denied to them for more than a century.
Thank you very much, Professor Pappe. It was our privilege and honor to listen to you during these circumstances where you were able to take us through the ongoing chapters of Nakba prior to 1947, 1948, during the actual eviction of Palestinians of Palestine in 1948, and the ongoing chapters that are going on after that, 1967, and other events, all the way to our day today, where we are just witnessing other chapters of ethnic cleansing and Nakba chapters taking place in all historical Palestine, not only in West Bank and Gaza, and actually Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, in Jordan, and in Syria in 2011, they are part of this, and they are kind of like creating this awareness about the ongoing Nakba every day during their struggle. So thank you very much. I like just to remind our audience about the major points that you mentioned, and I think I will start by the major idea you mentioned at the beginning, that a Nakba is not an event, it's a structure, it's a consequence of an ideology that is very much related and rooted in a colonial settler project in Palestine by the Zionist movement. I think this is very important for our audience to take from your talk. The other thing is the significance of terminology. We need to be very careful every time we talk about what's going on in Palestine. We need to be very careful about using even Palestinian themselves. And actually, it's because of the dominant narrative that is taking place everywhere about the struggle and Nakba. I think it's very important to remind ourselves of this terminology. And again, it was great that you called and addressed the importance of challenging the dominant narrative that is being spread about Nakba and all these events about the events in Palestine and Israel by the Israeli propaganda. It's very easy to see even people who feel for the Palestinian having these big questions about, but didn't they live by themselves? Wasn't that kind of like just shifting the land ownership peacefully, and the Palestinian decided to leave when the Arab armies told them they should leave? All these events should be, or narratives about these events should be challenged when we talk about a Nakba. And I think it's very important to remember that a Nakba is an ongoing crime that is representing this systematic racism, dehumanization of Palestinians every day, either under the occupation, either in their exiles as refugees who are prevented from having the right of return, and sometimes having the right of self-determination, which is very much related to the right of return, and at the same time, inside Israel, as we are witnessing at the moment in Jaffa, Haifa, Lid, and other cities where they are targeted by the extremists, and those extremists are protected by the state structure of the State of Israel. So I'm so grateful for all these important points that you brought to our audience, and I would like to remind our audience about the amazing 3 A's, let me put it that way, roadmap of acknowledgement, accountability, and acceptance. I think this can be a roadmap for us to kind of like adopt about decolonization, about challenging the dominant narrative, and about maintaining the solidarity and working towards enhancing the international alliance with regards to the Palestinian struggle. If you may, I would like just to mention to our audience that our next event will be with Professor Jeff Helper, who's also involved in this initiative of the One Democratic State campaign. We welcomed Professor Helper with Awad in November, and it was our first webinar on the One Democratic State solution. But this time we will welcome Professor Helper on June 5th, and it's another occasion to address the war of 1967, and we will be listening to him to talk to us about his book, Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine, Zionism, Settler Colonialism, and the Case for One Democratic State. So our audience, we really encourage you to buy Professor Helper book through Amazon, or contact your bookstores in your communities to be able to benefit from his talk about his book, which is very much related to what Professor Pappe talked to us today. Thank you very much. We wish you stay safe and go through these circumstances, and we will be so happy to have you again in the near future to talk to our audience again.
Thank you very much. We'll gladly do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
very much, everyone, and see you soon, hopefully.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.